tartışmasız bir şekilde
Well, voters in Turkey are set to head to the polls on Sunday, May 28, for a second time this month to elect a president after none of the three candidates for the presidential elections in Turkey were able to muster the 50% plus one threshold that they needed to win outright. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan will go head-to-head with the opposition's Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, and while the incumbent is in a strong position going into the vote, the opposition isn't giving up hope just yet. In this discussion, we will take a closer look at what to expect leading up to the election. I am joined by Yusuf Aram. He is editor-at-large for TRT World Public Broadcast, and Sami Hamdi, Managing Director at the International Interest, Risk and Intelligence Company. Welcome to both of you. Yusuf, let me start with you. We saw record turnout last Sunday. Almost 90% of those registered to vote in Turkey came out. And we all know that Turkish people do take elections seriously. It's a sacred event when it happens. And also, this is the first time in the Republic that we go to a runoff election. Let me ask you a question. How can we read the results, and what are the expectations of the runoff presidential elections in less than 2 weeks?
Well, first thing, it was definitely a very high voter turnout. I think the main reason for the high voter turnout is a couple of things. One, symbolic. It's the centennial. The book is closing on 1 century, opening on another century. Two, the vote, everyone knew it was going to be very close. So everyone wanted to be part of it. Everyone wanted to be heard. Erdogan supporters wanted him back in office. They knew it was the biggest challenge to his 21-year rule. The opposition felt like this was their final chance to actually unseat Erdogan. So everybody wanted to vote. Even those disgruntled with both candidates wanted to vote to make their voice and to make their opposition to both heard. So it was a tremendous show of democracy and a fantastic day, full of a lot of excitement. Now, how do we read the elections? Well, first of all, I think the most important data set to read is the 25% total nationalist vote that we saw. This is a record high for nationalist votes. When I mean nationalist votes, I'm talking about nationalists as a combined bloc, whether it be Erdogan's alliance partner, the MHP, whether it be the opposition alliance partner, E-Party, whether it be Ata Alliance, whether it be BBP. These are all nationalist parties, and they garnered about a total of 25%. That's a record high vote. Now, what does that mean? I think that means that the national security risks emanating from Syria, Kılıçdaroğlu's pledges for autonomy for the Southeast, this rhetoric concerned voters, and they found solace inside of the national vote. So I think it's very important to read that, because right now, almost a 6% block of the vote that's up for grabs in the runoff is a nationalist vote. So I think it's very important to read that nationalist vote. Now, otherwise, we saw Erdogan get 49.3%. How would I read that? For me, AK Party and MHP and their alliance winning parliament, but Erdogan getting under 50%. I would read that as this. I think many voters, very high on the agenda was inflation, the economic situation. I think these are issues that the voters blame Erdogan for, but at the same time, they view him as the solution to it too. I know it's a juxtaposition, but they view him as the man that got him into this, but can also most seriously and legitimately get him out of this as well. So that's how I view the vote. Again, they want to continue with him, but there is a bloc that is unhappy with him. I think he recognizes this. Same thing with the migration issue as well. That's very high on the agenda. The earthquake recovery, very high on the agenda. I think another important data set is the voting from the earthquake region. Erdogan coming in first and AK Party placing very high in many of the 11 provinces that were hit by the earthquake. So I think that's very important to see that the earthquake survivors, earthquake victims view Erdogan as the way forward, because there was a lot of talk. How are the earthquake victims going to vote? It's a meaningful vote for them. It's tremendous implications for their specific and direct future as well. So to see them place their vote of confidence in the incumbent, I think that speaks volumes about his performance since February 6th, after the earthquake happened, in that 3 to 4 month period. For the opposition, there's hope. They did not perform as well as they did. I think that is a big disappointment for them, but all is not lost. I think the enemies for both candidates right now, for Erdogan, the biggest enemy is complacency of his voters, thinking, hey, we have this in the bag. I don't need to vote. Maybe I might go, maybe I might not. That inability to mobilize could be his undoing in the second round. Otherwise, if he mobilizes.
Yeah, that's an extremely important point, Yusuf, that you bring up. How can President Erdogan and his party light fire, or at least increase the fire underneath his base, so they won't be complacent and they will still go out in record numbers on the 28th, on Sunday?
Okay. Well, I just want to finish the thought. I just had one more sentence. The biggest enemy for Erdogan would be complacency amongst his voters, feeling that they have this in the bag, that it's a guaranteed victory. And the biggest enemy for Kılıçdaroğlu and his supporters is losing hope, saying, we lost parliament, Erdogan's so close, we don't have a chance, and not turning up. So both sides, it's going to be a story of who mobilizes their supporters better in the second round. Now, how can Erdogan do this? Well, he's been very active. He's been constantly giving interviews, continuing to do rallies. He's not only talking about a victory, he wants to see him in his final election leave with a record level. His career record is 52.6%. He wants to see 53, 54. So he's giving the voters a goal. He's reaching out to them. He's talking. He's meeting with the presidential candidate that placed in third, trying to reach a deal with him. So he's been active. He's showing his supporters that he's been active, and he's hoping that that'll set an example and be able to mobilize them as well. Kılıçdaroğlu doing the same. He's been putting out videos on social media. He's been running around, changing up his philosophy a little, taking a more hard-nosed approach image on social media. So he's trying to change up his look, change up his image. And this is how both sides feel they can mobilize their bases.
And this is the point I'd like to segue and speak to Sami about. Sami, let me turn to you. The Turkey's opposition leader and Erdogan's rival Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu hardened his position and his tone. And after disappointing second place in the presidential election last Sunday, he was expected to beat the incumbent and longtime leader Erdogan. He didn't. His party didn't even fare that well. He vowed last Thursday to send back millions of refugees within 2 years. Who's he trying to appeal to, and will this strategy work now?
Thank you, Mohammed, for having me, and it's great to be with Yusuf as well, a good friend and a colleague. I think first and foremost, it's important to highlight that this sudden 180 that we've seen with regards to Kılıçdaroğlu in terms of going from Hayde and with the heart symbol to coming out with very hard rhetoric once more with regards to refugees has to do with this idea that he believes that the softer approach has not worked. He believed that if he adopted a softer approach, that if he presented himself as less divisive than President Erdogan, then essentially people would be able to rally around him. He would be able to have the Kurdish vote. He would be able to have those Islamist votes who are disgruntled with Erdogan and upset with some of his recent policies. And I think also Kılıçdaroğlu was very wary of making this about identity politics. And I think that was abundantly clear when he included Davutoglu and Babacan into his alliance, two people who are associated with the AK Party, who are associated with the Islamist movement and with the Islamic movement in Turkey, and also in Kılıçdaroğlu's promise, very loud promise, that the days of banning the headscarf, banning the hijab were over, and that he would even entrench it in the constitution. Essentially, Kılıçdaroğlu was aware that identity politics might play a role, and therefore he actively sought to allay these concerns and essentially try to ease the concerns of many of those who are perhaps disgruntled with Erdogan by saying, I'm not the same CHP or the same CHP that you guys perhaps didn't like once upon a time in the past. I think that given that that didn't work in the first round, given that we saw many criticism from the opposition, some saying that Davutoglu and Babacan got seats in the parliament on our backs without bringing enough votes to carry Kılıçdaroğlu past that line. I think what we're seeing is a reversal of strategy in going back to what feels more natural, rather than going with this approach of let's all be one heart, one Turkey, one nation, all together with all the people. The CHP is going back to the identity politics, the idea of being, we are going to protect this nation, we are going to protect we are going to protect Turkey from those who are coming in and infiltrating our veins, a loose translation of what Kilic Darulu was saying, trying to play on this, perhaps one can call it xenophobic tendencies that perhaps many who support Erdogan and many who support the Islamist trends believe the CHP represents. And I think one of the things that was quite profound is that on the election night, when Erdogan decided to go to the Hagia Sophia, and we saw the thousands of supporters with Erdogan, and they are chanting Islamic supplications, asking God to help them in the elections. And when we saw Kılıçdaroğlu go to Ataturk's grave and lay the flowers, the symbolism was in stark contrast, as if Erdogan was sending a message to his supporters, particularly the disgruntled supporters, which is that behind Kılıçdaroğlu's encompassing message lies the fascist tendencies. And this is why I think it's very interesting that Erdogan himself put a tweet out today or yesterday at the time of the recording, in which he said, look how Kılıçdaroğlu went from putting out the heart to going back to the pure fascist tendencies, which is this idea of kicking out the refugees, with Kılıçdaroğlu talking about 10 million refugees. So to go back to your question, to answer your question, I think Kılıçdaroğlu felt he was taking a gamble when he decided to go for the softer approach of saying we can all be one together, and he launched this alliance of 6 parties with different sides of political spectrum. I think Kılıçdaroğlu is now throwing that out the window. Let's go with what's worked for us before. Let's go back to what the CHP ideology or what CHP identity is about. Let's play those identity politics. Let's play Erdogan's identity politics. And as Yusuf was talking about the nationalist vote, it's appealing to that nationalist sentiment that I will not allow this threat. I will not allow the threat of the refugees. Whether that will succeed, given that there was a lot of concern that Kılıçdaroğlu's alliance or with some of the Kurdish elements, Kurdish parties, there was the suggestion that Selahattin Demirtas, the head of the HDP or HDP, which is considered to be by many in Turkey to be an extension of the PKK or the political wing, there was this suggestion that Kılıçdaroğlu's alliance with the HDP is what really rattled the nationalists, what really made them fear and concern. So the point being is Kılıçdaroğlu, as if he's saying to the nationalists, no, I will not compromise on this security. I remain nationalist and come and support me. It remains to be seen whether that will resonate.
I want to talk to you about the third candidate, Sinan Ogan, and I'll get to you, Yusuf, after that. How, everyone now is calling him the kingmaker, the person who both candidates right now are trying to appeal to, trying to appease. They're meeting with him. How serious is this candidate, Mr. Ogan, and will he really make a difference if he comes out supporting one of the 2 candidates?
I think Sinan Ogan is a conundrum, primarily because, firstly, Erdogan received 49.5% of the vote, around 49.5, 49.3. Erdogan only needs 0.5 or 0.7% of Ogan's vote, so less than 1%, to essentially make it past that 50% threshold. The idea that all of the 5-point-something% of Ogan will go to Kılıçdaroğlu, I think that's highly unlikely. Even if 4% go to Kılıçdaroğlu, I think it's reasonable to expect that 1% will go to Erdogan, and he'll go across that threshold. The second point that is worth noting is that Kılıçdaroğlu, although he came behind Erdogan, he did get 44%. And to put that into context, remember that the closest opposition have come to toppling Erdogan has always been within the 30s, 35, 36, that sort of percentage. And I think that 44%, and then the backlash that Davutoglu and Babacan have gotten from some of the CHP supporters that they didn't bring anything to the table in terms of votes, and the resignations that we're seeing recently from the Deva party, from Davutoglu's parties and the other, it may well be that the Islamists who voted for Kılıçdaroğlu, who were disgruntled with Erdogan and who decided to go with Davutoglu and Babacan, it may well be that with Kılıçdaroğlu's shift in rhetoric, they decide to say, look, no matter how bad Erdogan might be in our perspective, Kılıçdaroğlu is now showing his true colors. And therefore, it's better if we go back to Erdogan and take our 0.5, 0.6% and go towards Erdogan. the reason why I mentioned it is that while Erdogan may entertain the prospect of negotiating with Orhan, calling him a kingmaker suggests that he has the decisive power. Whereas I think that Erdogan will believe that while Orhan will try to pitch himself as a kingmaker, Erdogan is not under the same pressure as Kılıçdaroğlu is to make the concessions to Orhan. And the final point that's worth noting is this. Orhan pictures himself as the nationalist, but Erdogan is already in an alliance with the nationalist, with the MHP, with the MHP. And it remains to be seen whether Erdogan would want to upset the MHP and upset his alliance with the MHP by offering concessions to Orhan that they might not be happy with, given that they want to see themselves as the representatives of the nationalists. So from Erdogan's perspective, it may well be that he decides, let me gamble. As it stands, I got the polls right last time. AKP were already in, according to AKP polls, they believe they were always going to beat Kılıçdaroğlu. It was international polls that suggested, or other polls that suggested he would lose. But AKP appears to have their hand on the pulse. It may well be, and I finish on this sentence, it may well be that Erdogan believes, I don't need to offer those concessions. Those votes will come to me anyway. I'll get above that 50% and I'll win the second round.
Yusuf, how significant is Mr. Ogun's support to either candidates?
Just one little nuance to what Sami said. He said that Kılıçdaroğlu, at his almost 45%, got the highest vote for the opposition in the Erdogan period. But I think it's also important to note that Kılıçdaroğlu's vote is a consolidated vote. If you look at the 2018 results from 5 years ago, and you tally up the votes that all the candidates from members of his alliance got, it totals back up to 45% or 44%. So he didn't increase the opposition's vote, really. He just brought the whole vote under one
together.
It's still the same. It's still the same vote. The only reason why Erdogan didn't break 50% was because of the presence of Sinan Oğan. Now, to judge Sinan Oğan's popularity, it's really hard. What Sinan Oğan's true vote is. Why? Because you have two very popular candidates in Kılıçdaroğlu and Erdogan. They've been around for a long time. Their supporters are very diehard, and their opposition is very diehard. And those people that don't like either will always look for a disgruntled voter outlet. So Sinan Oğan, it's hard to gauge what his actual vote is and how much of that 5.2, 5.3% is just a disgruntled vote that saw him as an outlet. Now, he has three options. He can support Kılıçdaroğlu, he can support Erdogan, or he can say, I'm not supporting anyone. My voters can vote how they are. Now, I want to examine each of those options very quickly. If he says, I don't support anyone, my voters can vote as they are, I think that's probably the most dangerous choice for him. Why is that the most dangerous? It gives the perception to the voter that even he is concerned that he doesn't have the influence over his 5%, which makes him in the future a much less significant player. He will be viewed as a fluke, someone who was just there and benefited from a disgruntled vote. So he has to choose one side. Now, I'm sure in his mind, he's crunching numbers too, and he sees Erdogan as the likely winner. Now, let's say he supports Kılıçdaroğlu and throws his 5.3% behind Kılıçdaroğlu. If Kılıçdaroğlu loses, then everyone understands that Sinan Oğan never controlled his 5.3%. So that's another risk for him as well. And he's still a young politician. If he plays his cards right, he could be a much bigger name in 2028, come 5 years from now. Now, if he puts his weight behind Erdogan and comes out for him, and Erdogan, who is expected to win, wins by a healthy margin, it'll always leave a question mark in everyone's mind. Was Sinan Oğan the man that put Erdogan over? And I think personally, as an individual, as a presidential candidate, that's the image, the perception that he wants to leave voters in the mind of voters for 2023 elections, that it was him that carried Erdogan past the threshold. And you'll never know the truth if it was Erdogan himself or Sinan's support that carried him past. So I think he'll play it safe. I think he'll think about his future. And at the end of the day, he's a former member of MHP. So his hardcore supporters would most likely view Erdogan and his MHP partner, alliance partner, as much more palatable than, say, someone who's getting support from the HDP, even if it's outside support, someone who HDP has gone on the record saying, we support. So I view an Erdogan endorsement as most likely Again, I don't know how much of that 5.2% Sinan Oğan really does control. I would probably say half of it is his true vote in this election. That doesn't mean that if they were all newcomers and all things equal, all conditions equal, he can't get more. But in the presence of two very popular, two very long-term politicians coming from two of Turkey's most powerful parties, I think he would probably get 2.5% would be his true hardcore vote. And I even think that might be slightly optimistic.
Sami, let me ask you, there's a perception in the West that President Erdogan is anti-West. He's had his issues with the White House. He's had issues with many European countries and leaders. And this is something that his opposition rival played on. How different should we expect if the future Turkish foreign policy regionally and internationally, if the opposition's candidate, Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu, wins versus Mr. Erdogan, the incumbent?
I think that is true that Erdogan's relationship with the West has been quite fraught and quite troubled in recent times. And I think that a lot of the issues that are underlying, or rather underpin that, continue to be dominant in discourse. However, I do think that the assertion that Erdogan is anti-West that has been presented in many Western media, I think has been a false one. I think the reality is, and I think it's something perhaps that Western analysts are very loath to admit, the reality is that Erdogan came to Europe and came to the US asking for closer ties and asking for greater relationship, asking for accession to the EU, making it absolutely clear that he saw Turkey as being closer to Europe and the US as opposed to the regions where it's closer in today. It was Europe that turned around to Erdogan and said, in the words of Sarkozy, that Turkey doesn't belong in Europe, it belongs in Asia Minor. It is Europe that decided against the accession process, primarily because it was unsure whether a Muslim majority country has a place in Europe or not. And I think that that's when we see Erdogan eventually turning towards the Middle East, to Central Asia, and then to Africa, where he scored huge successes in expanding Turkey's soft power and then asserting Turkey's independence in its foreign policy, whether in Libya or in the Mediterranean or in Syria and Central Asia, to finally carve out a seat for Turkey on the same table as the superpowers of Russia, US, and Europe and the like. The reason why I mention that is that Kılıçdaroğlu has been promising closer ties with the West, and he's been painting Erdogan as someone who took Turkey away from the West. But the reason that Kılıçdaroğlu's approach appears to be naive is because if Kılıçdaroğlu wins, when he goes to Europe and he says to them, I want to be close to you, Europe's position on Turkey has not changed. Turkey doesn't belong to you in Europe according to the EU powers. They want to restrict it either to a customs union, and even that they're not inclined towards. They want to restrict Turkey's relationship as more of a cooperation than an actual joining part of the EU. When Kılıçdaroğlu comes across that in Brussels, the reality is he will only have one option, which is to go down the same path Erdogan did, which is to look at other continents, other alternatives, trying to carve out an independence in Turkey's foreign policy and pushing back against the Europe and Washington that doesn't demonstrate an appreciation of the legitimate concerns of Turkey. And to give an example for anybody listening, you look at the Mediterranean, for example, when Erdogan sent Turkish troops to Libya to rescue the internationally recognized government, or when he announced the unilateral maritime border with Libya, if you were sitting in Ankara and you pulled out a map, you could see that powers that were antagonistic to Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, Israel, Egypt, and then Haftar marching on Tripoli, any Turkish policymaker looking at that map will see there was a chokehold forming on the Mediterranean. When Turkey was saying to Europe, I'm very concerned about this, Europe's reaction was one of antagonism, which forced Erdogan to adopt a more independent foreign policy and assert himself and say to them, listen, if you don't listen to my concerns, I will find a way to leverage and impose them instead. And this is why I think that while the two candidates, the suggestion is they are presenting two very different foreign policy initiatives, I think the reality is that Erdogan is presenting the realistic, finished version of Turkey's foreign policy, which is now that it's become a regional heavyweight, which is it become a major power that is able to assert itself and be taken seriously. Whereas Kılıçdaroğlu is sort of rewinding and wants to start the process all over again, where Europe tells him you're not part of Europe, and then Kılıçdaroğlu finds himself trying to carve out a foreign policy in the same way Erdogan did. But the final point is this. The reality is that Kılıçdaroğlu and Erdogan have very different capabilities when it comes to foreign policy. Erdogan has been able to carve out that independent foreign policy because he's evoked a resonance in the key regions, whether it's in Africa or Middle East or in Central Asia. In Africa, his resonance is such, his personal resonance is such that Macron has been lamenting that Turkey is pushing France out of some of its strongholds. In Central Asia as well, where the US and Europe are spending money to try to redefine the identity of Central Asia countries, Erdogan forms the Turkic Council, and he's the one now asserting himself over there. The point here being is, Kılıçdaroğlu does not have the same resonance. He doesn't evoke that same resonance. So the environment through which Erdogan has been able to operate will not exist if Kılıçdaroğlu comes to power.
Yusuf, it's no surprise that many of the Turkish population or Turkish nationalists living abroad, about 65% give and take, have voted for AK Party as well as President Erdogan. Can you explain to us why is that? And also talk to us about the Turkish foreign policy in the coming years. If President Erdogan wins, will we see a continuation of his foreign policy of past years, or what kind of change will be faced with?
Well, one of the reasons why Erdogan is very popular overseas, especially in Arab nations with Turkish expats, or in Europe with Turkish expats. I'm putting the United States aside because they're heavily in favor of Kılıçdaroğlu. When we look at the profile of Turkish citizens, especially in Europe, we see many of these people went to Europe as workers back in the 70s and 80s. So you have a more conservative, more working class group throughout Europe, especially in Germany, which is Erdogan's stronghold, or Belgium or France, another Erdogan stronghold, or throughout the Arab world where they resonate with Erdogan's conservative policy. So the voter makeup of the Turks living in these countries is either workers from the 70s and 80s, now a second or third generation living overseas, or very conservative Turks as well. Hence, they tend to matriculate towards Erdogan at the ballot box, and that's the main reason why. Now, just to touch a little upon what Sami was saying with Erdogan's relationship with the West, I think the major problem, the structural problem between Turkey and the United States, or Turkey and the collective West, is that the West has never redefined Turkey's role inside the collective West, or inside the transatlantic alliance, since the Cold War. The Cold War has ended. The major Soviet threat was lifted. Turkey underwent the late 90s and early 2000s, and then a major period of economic boom, manufacturing boom, technological boom, diplomatic boom. And Turkey's ambitions have now changed. Now, when you look at Turkey from a Washington perspective, they're not the henchman or the guard dog anymore. They're saying, you know what? I'm kind of a boss in my own right. And when you design regional policies, especially in my region, I'm going to be at the table when that's being designed. If I'm not at the table when that's being designed, then I'm not going to be on board with it. And if I'm not on board with it, you're not going to be successful. And we've seen that throughout the region in many places. Not talking to Turkey before Russia sanctions, not talking with Turkey during the Arab Spring, not talking to Turkey on Syria, on migration, on many of these issues, or in the Eastern Mediterranean. None of these supposed regional security that the United States likes to talk about, but they're 5,000 miles away from the region. None of these designs or none of these plans were drawn up with Turkey's input at the beginning. And then they expect Turkey to be on the board when Turkey has its own set of ambitions and own set of interests as well, and own national security concerns. So I think that's one of the major structural strategy problems that creates this divergence. And when you look at the United States and Turkey, or NATO and Turkey, it's a security-centric relationship. When the security net on security falls apart, you don't really have a lot to keep that relationship up. Then you start getting major structural and core issue divergences between both sides. Now, what's going to happen if Erdogan wins? I think he was very brave in his interview, restating his support for the migrant issue, saying they're not ready to go back yet. I'm not going to send them back. He could have very easily taken a populist view and said, you know what? Yeah, they're going to go back. We're going to do it as soon as possible. Very easy. He probably would have gained points. It probably would have helped him. But he stuck to his guns. I think the economic policies will continue. I think the balance on Ukraine and Russia will continue. I think he'll more actively now start looking at trying to broker at least a temporary ceasefire, if not a more permanent one. I think we'll see a new surge with new enthusiasm towards the EU. He's now comfortable. He has a 5-year mandate. And I think this last 5 years, since it's his last 5 years, he's really going to concentrate on legacy building. And I think one of his legacies he wants, if it's not European Union membership, he wants at least a modernization of the custom union as a notch on his belt, and also lifting the Schengen visa regime as a notch on his belt. I think these are two accomplishments that he wants to accredit to his career before it's all over. So I think he'll actively pursue these. And I also do think that the Africa policy will continue as well, growing bilateral trade with Africa, increasing influence with Africa, trying to reach some type of understanding and more acceptable status quo in the Eastern Mediterranean with Greece as well. They'll probably be very closely following Greek elections. So that's going to be interesting to see who wins and who comes victorious out of Athens.
Gentlemen, great analysis of the upcoming Turkish runoff, presidential runoff race in less than 2 weeks. Thank you so much for your time. And very quickly, prediction. I'll start with you, Yusuf. On May 29th, who would we would be calling the incoming president in Turkey?
I think if the May 14th results are reflected again, statistically speaking, Erdogan only needs 12% of the vote. That's up for grabs to win. Statistically, he seems much closer to the finish line.
Sami?
I think it's an Erdogan victory. I can't see it happening any other way unless something extraordinary happens.
Thank you so much, Yusuf Aram, editor-at-large at TRT World Public Broadcast, and Sami Hamdi, Managing Director. Thank you so much.